Hey gang, welcome to volume 24 of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Thanks for checking out my humble little channel, and remember, I'd love to share your stories right here for the world to hear. None of this for your chance stuff that you hear elsewhere. Hey, you send it, I'll share it. Speaking of which, if you have a creepy fast food story, please send it and any other story you might have to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Now, kick back. Let's do this. Anna Banana by Free Radical. My next-door neighbor and I were kids when our former babysitter killed herself. She had a history of mental issues, but nothing ever surfaced when she babysat me that I can recall. She always seemed really nice. My friend and I, being typical young boys, used to make fun of her behind her back. Her name was Anna, and therefore we christened her Anna Banana. We would giggle ourselves into fits over it. Fast forward a year or so, where one evening she went behind the local Catholic church and shot herself in the head. My next-door neighbor's parents were close to the girl's family, and so my friend was asked to help clear out her room after the suicide. My friend was a bit spooked at the prospect, so he asked me to join him, and I accepted, and here's what happened when we both began clearing her room. The room itself was pretty nondescript, standard belongings of a girl in her late teens. I remember there were framed photographs, a few stuffed animals, and a closet with a cardboard box inside. The box was there for us to place the objects contained in the room, and the box was empty, save for her telephone. Our plan was pretty simple. We started taking the items within the room and placing them in piles on the floor based upon their size. Big pile, medium pile, and small pile. Neither of us said much, as we really didn't know how to feel about the situation. Neither of us had experienced the death of anyone close to us, so we just kept quiet and placed the items into our piles. When the piles were completed, my friend went to pull the cardboard box from the closet, and Anna's phone began to ring. Our first instinct was to run, but something came over us. I'm probably too terrified to run, so we just stood there looking at each other. I then looked at the phone and again back to my friend. I managed to utter a single sentence. "You answer it." And he looked back at me with a composed part of, "Are you crazy?" and part, "I'll show you." He walked over to the phone and picked up the receiver. He put the phone up to his ear and looked at me. His eyes went wild, and he dropped the phone and bolted for the door. My initial instinct was to run with him, but I held back, staring at the phone as it bounced off the carpet, the receiver landing face up. I stared at it, and I could hear a voice coming from it, but it was too faint to really make out anything. All I know is that it was repeating the same thing over and over. It had a strange rhythm to it, like a childhood sing-song. This moment staring at the phone probably took all of 4 seconds, but it felt like hours. I looked at the phone cradle and realized that the phone jack was not connected to the wall input. This phone should have been dead, yet there was a voice still speaking on the other line. I had to do something, anything, to snap out of this trance, so I decided to pick up the receiver. I had to know what he had heard, what was on the other line. I reached down and slowly lifted the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end became clearer. Truth be told, I never got the phone up to my ear, as I suddenly understood what was being said on the other line. I ran from the room, from the house, and to this day, I have never been back there. When I got the phone close enough to my ear that I finally made out what was being said, it was a young woman's voice repeating the same taunting words over and over and over. "Anna Banana, Anna Banana, Anna Banana, Anna Banana." Danny. It was Townsend, Massachusetts, in 1987. My parents' lawyer came home from work to find his wife raped and shot to death in their bedroom, and their 2 kids raped and drowned in a bathtub. When the news hit the next morning, there were no suspects, and people were freaked out. This was a huge thing in our town of 8,000 people. I mean, nobody locked their doors, and I remember my father putting deadbolts on that very afternoon. Everybody in school was scared shitless, too. The next day came, and we found out the suspect was this 17-year-old kid named Danny LaPlante. Every kid knew who he was. Among the Iron Maiden shirt-wearing toughs, he was the one everyone was terrified of because he seemed just wrong. I remember his friends taunting a kid, mean but harmless in retrospect, but Danny came out of nowhere and broke the kid's arm. And that was at recess. He was just 13 at the time. After finding out Danny was the suspect, we all went to school to find our middle school's gym taken over as an FBI staging area. Things got scarier the next day. They still couldn't find him. Yeah, there were sightings, but he did a home invasion and a carjacking in the town over, but they still couldn't catch him. Word was that he knew the woods like the back of his hand and he was running around out there. That scared the shit out of me because our house was right against the wilderness. And that night I snuck down to the basement, grabbed my dad's machete, and put it under my bed. Finally, they did catch him. And then the news came out with a scary-ass crime he had committed when he was 15, but only served a little time in juvie for. This was the dude's prequel. This girl who had broken up with Danny 2 weeks earlier hadn't seen him, and weirdly no one had. She was babysitting her sisters while her father was out. The kids started to notice weird things that night when they were watching the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street. They opened a box of fiddle faddle and took a bowl and went back to the movie. When they went back for more, the box was empty. In hindsight, they noticed how weird it was, but had no conception of what was coming next. The movie finished and the girls went off to change for bed. At the same time, the dad came home. The youngest daughter, 8 or so, was in her bedroom. She opened her closet and found Danny LaPlante standing there with a hatchet. He was dressed in her mother's dead clothes with makeup smeared on his face. He told her to be quiet and tied her up. He eventually tied up the whole family in the bedroom. He told them he was going to kill him. He left and said he'd be right back and they should start praying. The guess is he went to ransack for valuables, and thankfully the youngest was able to wriggle free. She ran to a neighbor's house who called the cops before coming back over with a pistol to free the family. He freed the dad and the daughters, but didn't see LaPlante. The cops came and they couldn't find him either. The family stayed with relatives for 2 weeks to get away from the house. In that time, nobody found LaPlante. The family did have to go home, and when they pulled in their driveway, they saw that motherfucker standing in the window. And the father started yelling, and neighbors came over, and they all surrounded the house. Soon the cops came, and they searched the house. They didn't find Danny, but they found a very disturbing scene. Pennies were glued to the ceiling. There was strange writings all over the walls, and all of their clothes, furniture, and fucking everything, it seemed, had been jacked off on. But no Danny. They searched the entire house, and nothing. Nothing, that is, until a cop in the basement heard a noise coming from behind the washing machine. All the cops rushed in and pulled the washing machine away from the wall and found a hole. And in that hole was Danny. Not only did they find Danny, but they figured out that since the time the girl broke up with him, he had been living in the family's walls. They found peepholes everywhere. Sometimes the truth is scarier than the paranormal. The Thing I Wasn't Supposed to See by Prudentis. For the record, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and was not on any medication, and I'm definitely sane, no mental or emotional problems whatsoever. This happened in Johannesburg, South Africa. A few years ago, I was sitting on the couch in the lounge, doing crossword puzzles. I'm a night owl, and I love the quiet of the night. And the rest of my family were already in bed fast asleep. My lounge doesn't have doors, and the couch was facing the passageway. The lights were on in the lounge and the passage, and my couch was about 2 or 3 meters away from the passage. So I'm doing my puzzle, and suddenly I get the feeling that somebody's watching. I'm sure you all know that feeling, like you can sense when you are just being watched. I looked up from my crossword puzzle and stared straight into his big, burning red round eyes. His eyes were very big and very round and literally glowing, similar like a red-hot burning coal, but kind of hypnotic. I sat there, frozen on the couch, shocked, and staring into these eyes. I just couldn't move. Although we didn't speak, when our eyes met, I heard something in my head and understood the words that said,
"You are not supposed to see me."
He stood there frozen, and I was frozen on the couch. I could see the shock and surprise in his eyes, and I kept on hearing something that I was not supposed to see him. It was as if he was communicating with me telepathically. I keep saying him, but there were no visible genitals. He was short, probably the size of a 6 or 8-year-old kid, naked, pitch black skin, and no body hair at all, and again, no visible genitals. His arms were long in proportion to his body, almost ape-like. His hands and feet were very big in proportion to his body, but I didn't take detailed note of his fingers and toes. I just saw these long arms, almost reaching to his calves. Very well-defined calves, very short and muscular legs, and a short, broad, muscular torso. He had a very big head, and that was also out of proportion to his body. In other words, just too big for it. He had those big, glowing red eyes. I don't know for how long we stared at each other in shock. It could have been a few seconds or a few minutes. Time seemed to kind of stand still. Then all of a sudden he turned to his right and ran super fast down the passage toward my son's bedroom. I jumped off the couch in hot pursuit and searched my son's room, but this thing had simply vanished into thin air. I have to admit that I was very disappointed that he disappeared like that, as I would have liked to communicate with him, despite my feeling of terror when our eyes locked. I've seen other things during the course of my life, and more so when I was a child, but those were always human in appearance and almost ethereal. But this thing was different. It was solid in appearance, and I could see its chest moving in and out as he breathed and was standing in the lit passageway. This was definitely no ghost or spirit entity. Since I don't think it was a ghost or a spirit, could it possibly have been something that bled through from another dimension? Is It a Real Gift? By Alicia. Me, my mother, 3 brothers, and stepfather lived in an old log cabin near my grandparents a few years ago. The door to my small room on the top floor had a word or phrase in a different language, I think it was Spanish, and was faded into the door. My mother and stepfather didn't think anything of it. My mother held a secret I didn't know until I told her what I had seen later on in this memory. My stepfather was as hypocritical as they come, because he claimed to be a Christian, but did very unchristian things. I wonder even now what he was so afraid of. Anyway, I was called a demon, and I was told I was going to hell countless times. Anger would often overcome me, and I became unaware of my true self at times. It makes me wonder if something in that cabin influenced me to be that way. There were 2 instances when what my mother would call a gift revealed itself. The instance when my mother suspected I had this so-called gift was the most harmless. It was one night when we were going out to do something, and I don't remember what. But, before we left, I saw what looked like a shadow of a child come out of the corner of my eyes. It ran from the living room to the kitchen. I looked around the corner into the kitchen right as I was about to leave. My mother asked me what I was looking at, and I said, "I thought I just saw a little kid run into the kitchen." Mother told me to be quiet, and we left to do whatever we were setting out to do. There were many more like this, but it would take me forever to explain them. The only 2 characters I would see were the small child and a grown man. I do not know if someone had died in that house, but it was an old place, so it's a possibility. I do know it used to be some kind of business. For the rest of this story, I'm going to focus on the most harmful time, the one that made me fear for my life. My stepfather and mother were partiers. They would go to parties and leave me to tend to my 3 brothers. Most nights I would not have a problem, but this night made me almost lose my sanity. Even now I can't sleep with the lights completely off or watch a scary movie, look at a knife, and I look at things in a very different way. I was home alone with my 3 brothers while my mom and stepdad went to a party, or maybe they went clubbing, doesn't really matter. At first, my brothers were in bed and I was staying up in case they needed something. At around 3 in the morning, I was just sitting there watching television. I felt a presence in the room with me. I didn't think much of it until I saw a large, black, shadow-like man in the corner of my eye. I looked in that direction, and you know when you do something like this, the thing you thought you saw disappears? Well, I looked, and it took about 5 seconds to disappear. I was kind of rattled by this, and I was struck with an overwhelming fear. I mean, it really scared the hell out of me. I went into the kitchen because I could see more of the house from there, excluding my mother and stepfather's room and the small hallway near the front door. I saw the man again, and I called my friend. He said I was crazy, not believing me, and hurt my feelings, so now I was scared and hurt. I grabbed a large knife from the cabinet, and now when I look back on it, I question how a knife would have helped me if this thing had any intention of hurting me. It may have had that intention, but I have no way of knowing. My brother Tyler came into the living room, and he said he saw something in his room, but I told him to sit on the couch and go back to sleep. Instead, he went into my other brother Blake's room. I started talking like it was really there, and the reason I said this is because I'm having trouble even now believing it. I was saying things like, "Leave me alone," and "Get out of here," and "You're not scaring me." But, ironically enough, I was shaking in the middle of the living room with a knife in my hand, and tears running down my cheeks. Every time I saw it, I screamed. And I don't know why none of my brothers came to see what was wrong. Maybe they were unable to hear me over their dreams. Finally, I went outside on the porch and called my other friend, who is now my boyfriend and has been for over a year, and started talking to him about it. He offered to let me talk to his grandmother, but I just wanted to talk to him. And he helped, but when I saw that man outside, I nearly fainted. I ran back into the house and stayed there. My boyfriend eventually went to bed after I had calmed down and was too tired to cry and scream anymore. My mother came back at about 5 in the morning with her pants off, her hair a mess, and a long shirt on. She was drunk, of course. My stepfather smiled and acted like an idiot. I told them to never leave me home alone again like that, and they just laughed. My mom told me to be quiet and go to bed. I did just what I was told and went to sleep. And I'll tell you, I slept like a baby, but I was terrified. About a week after that, my mother woke me up to take me to my driver's education class. On the way there, she told me that she had seen all the things that I had seen and then some more. I was confused at this, and she told me that it was a gift. I still have weird intuitions and odd voices in my head, but I have not seen, well, yeah, actually I have. And I don't want to sound crazy here, but I've seen hands come from the walls and try to grab me, and I've heard screams in my ear. I still feel presences around me, and I feel like something is out to get me sometimes, but ever since I put a Christian necklace on my neck, I haven't had that many problems. I don't really talk to anybody about this. My mother did have a secretive history with witchcraft, along with my great-uncle. She wanted to teach me some, but I am afraid to venture into things like that. But that's another story. I still have weird feelings about this entire thing. And all I can say to people who are involved in things like this, make sure you're safe and put a cross or anything of the sort on you to at least get you some protection. Pray and ask for protection from God so that maybe you won't have to go through an experience like I did. My Stalker at Work, submitted by Vector EPS. I'm going to start out by saying that I'm a gay male and a graphic artist to give people an idea of where I'm coming from. I heard a story on Uncle Josh a while back about a gay guy who had a stalker and thought I'd share my story about a creeper I met at my old job. Thanks for reading this if you do, Uncle Josh. It was 2010 and I was 25 at the time. I took a new job at a small boutique ad agency in the city I lived in and was happy to be doing real graphic design and not the layouts I had been doing for a phone book and classified ad company. Everyone there was super nice. And there were about 20 total people that all did different things, from design to public relations and media buying. And there were also the sales team, and we called them account managers. One of the account managers was named Tom. He was part of the interview panel I went before to determine if I was a good fit for the company, and even then I got weird vibes from him right off the bat. He was a good-looking guy in his 30s that was married and had a son who he talked about all the time. But there was a side of him that I don't think too many people knew about until what I'm going to tell you came to light. Tom was overly interested in me from the get-go. During the interview process, he would stare at me and afterwards ask me odd questions as I was leaving the office. Stuff about my personal life, and while it wasn't really intrusive, it seemed a little inappropriate. Like if I had a girlfriend and stuff like that. I don't expect people to know that I'm gay, but it just felt a little weird. So I got hired, and the phone call with my boss Andy was really cool, and I was excited to get things rolling. I left my old job, and on the last day there, I got a call from Tom. He said he was very happy that I was coming on board, and that I'd be working for a lot of his accounts. I thought this was odd, as he must have looked up my then current employer somehow and called, because he didn't have my cell, and he didn't call that, and he obviously didn't know it. I chalked it up to a guy being overzealous and loving his job, but it still was kind of weird. So my first day of work was easy, meeting people and talking with the account team and just getting settled in. And here comes Tom. A bunch of people were going to walk up the street to a restaurant for lunch, and he invited me to go, even though 4 other people had already asked me. Again, not an issue, but it was odd, seeing as he was with us when they first asked me. We go to the lunch place, and Tom makes a point to sit right next to me, and kept offering me a taste of the food he got. I politely said no thanks, but he kept bringing it up until I finally just laughed and told him to take off. If that doesn't let you know I'm from Canada, I don't know what will. So the week goes by, and Tom makes it a habit to stop by my desk at least twice a day, and keeps asking about girlfriends and such. And now I just laugh and blow him off, but in a nice way. That Friday night, a couple of people were going to happy hour and asked if I wanted to go, and I said sure. They were a really nice group of people, and we are all still good friends, even though I'm now working as a freelancer. Somehow Tom heard about happy hour and goes also. We're all walking down the street to this cool, trendy bar, and I have a couple of beers, but I knew that I had to go to the gym before meeting friends for a late dinner and some cocktails. I mentioned this to my new friend Ben, and Tom immediately jumped in and started asking me what gym I went to, and what kinds of clothes I like to work out in. Just goofy shit like that. I mean, sneakers would be one thing, but he was asking if I like spandex shorts and things like that. I called it a night right there and said goodbye to everyone and left for the gym. I got a workout in, went home to my apartment and showered before heading out to see my friends. I was excited to tell them all about my new job, so we got a bite and then hung out at some place to have some drinks. When I got to my part about Tom, my friend Chris laughed and said the guy sounded like a creeper, and that's when I hear Tom's voice ask out loud, "Who's a creeper?" He had somehow found out where I was going and pretended to just be popping in to meet someone, but he never really did meet anyone. He just stood around with me and my friends. And he didn't really say anything either, and it was super awkward. When my friend Walt asked him where the person he was supposed to be there to see was, Tom mumbled something and said goodnight and walked away. On Monday, I didn't see much of Tom, which was weird, but I didn't complain. On Tuesday morning, I got in to find a package on my chair, and when I opened it, it was a pair of really skimpy men's underwear. No note or nothing. I'd figured maybe it was some kind of joke, but when I brought it up to everyone else, no one said anything. Later that day, I got a text from an unknown number, and it just said, "Like your present?" I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. I forgot about it because Andy asked me to come up with my own ideas about a new product line for one of our clients, and I was charged up to impress him and the owner of the ad agency. Everyone was leaving for the night, but I kept going. I was in the zone and didn't want to stop the creative vibe. And then my phone went off. An unknown number again, and a text that said, "Working late, huh?" Again, I responded with, "Who is this?" But nothing happened. I decided to wrap things up and left for home. I said goodnight to the owner as he was still there, and he asked me how things were going so far. I told him it was good, and he said to come to him with anything. I was tempted to tell him about the underwear. That night I was online with a guy I liked, and I'll call him Daryl, and we were talking about being an official couple. I'd known him for a couple of years, but we didn't get together until recently. We were chatting away, making plans for the weekend, when I looked at my phone that was buzzing on my nightstand. I hadn't heard it, but there were 15 messages from an unknown number. There were a few, "What are you up to's?" and "Why aren't you answering?" and then a bunch of D pics. I told Daryl about it, and he told me to save everything but not to respond. I didn't, said goodbye to him, and my phone buzzed again. It was another message asking where I was and if I liked what I saw. The next day I showed Andy my preliminary work, and he liked it and said to keep developing it with a couple of changes, so I was happy about that. When I sat back down, I felt someone come up behind me, and I smelled the cologne Polo, and someone who had obviously put on way too much. Guess who? Tom. He leaned over me really close and asked if I was going to make his client happy. I calmly leaned back to let him know that he was too close, and he moved over to the side of my desk and sat down. It was odd, but what I was working on was for one of his accounts. He kept it professional and said that it was great to have me on board. Later that night, I got another crotch pick, but this time the person was wearing the underwear that was sent to me the other day. I immediately knew it had to have been someone from work. When I went in the next day, I looked in the drawer I had thrown those things in, and they weren't there. Red alert, I know. But I was already uncomfortable getting them and didn't want to make waves as a new employee. My mind would change about that pretty quick. Things got creepier as Tom somehow figured out what gym I went to, and he joined it too. We would see each other there and say hi, but as soon as I finished a workout, he would stop too and bump into me in the locker room, even though he'd only been there for 15 minutes. He always asked if I showered there, and I told him I just went home. Again, just kind of icky. The text messages kept coming, and I finally texted back, "Tom, stop it. This isn't funny or cool. If you keep bothering me, I'm talking to Andy about this." The text stopped, and Tom rarely talked to me at work, for a couple of weeks, outside of group meetings about project progress. Then, one night, Daryl was over at my apartment and my phone rings. It rang for phone calls, and it was also how people accessed my apartment building, too. It was Tom. He says he needs to talk to me, and I tell him I'm really busy and can't right that minute, and he replied that it was urgent. I again told him no, and Daryl grabbed the phone and told him to go away. I heard Tom scream into the phone, "Let me the fuck in this building!" Daryl hung up the phone, and immediately it rang again, but we didn't answer it. I was freaking out, saying I was going to call the cops, and then Daryl asks, "What if someone else lets him in?" My face went white, and I said, "Let's get out of here, go someplace public, and we can call the police from there." I know it sounds weird, but I didn't want to be trapped in my apartment, and thought going to a cafe bar up the street would be a better place to be. The phone kept ringing, and I can hear Tom leaving threatening messages on my answering machine. I grabbed my wallet and cell phone, and we left my place, and Daryl suggests we take the stairs in case Tom somehow did get into the building. I lived on the 8th floor, so we started making our way down the stairs, and when we got into the main hallway downstairs, we saw Tom getting into the elevator with someone else who obviously let him in. He turned and looked at us as the doors shut, and he yelled out, I'm sure scaring the hell out of my neighbor. We ran for the door and hit the street, busting out of there, totally freaking out. Daryl and I went to the cafe and immediately went to the back, away from the windows. I called 911 and tell the guy what's going on, that this Tom guy has been harassing me and is now in my apartment building, and we also told him where we were. He told me to stay put and wait for officers to show up. During this time, Daryl had went to the front and came back saying that Tom was walking up and down the street looking into all the windows of the bars and shops. I crouched down and put my hood on my sweatshirt up, shaking. I'm in great shape, and very well built if I may say so, but I don't want to get into a fight or confront this guy who's obviously messed up. 2 officers finally got there, and we gave them the update of what was going on, and that Tom was no longer in my building. They took down all of my information and asked if I could stay someplace else that night instead of going home. Daryl said I could stay with him, and they advised me we go straight there and to call if anything else happens. But there's not much they can do because he didn't physically threaten us, and he didn't break into my building technically. I'm pissed now more than scared, but agree, and we leave the place and start the 6 or 7 block walk to Daryl's apartment. He lived above a liquor store, so we were just going to get some booze and chill at his place watching movies while we figured out what I was going to do the next day. About halfway there, we hear running footsteps, and I look over my shoulder to see Tom running at us. He's wearing nothing but a trench coat and boots, and I mean nothing else. Although I was freaking out, I did kind of let out a shrill laugh, as this was kind of funny, although terrifying at the same time. We took off like rockets, and he couldn't keep up. So we skipped the booze and got into Daryl's apartment, and I called the police again, and they are there in record time and actually caught Tom. They asked us to come down and identify him as he was sitting in a car, and they shine lights in his face and we say, yeah, that's him. He kept trying to say something through the half-open window, but the police kept telling him to shut up. In the pockets of his coat, he had zip ties and a knife, and I saw them sitting on the hood of the car. That really tripped me out. That night I called Andy and told him what was going on, and he was blown away. He had known Tom for years and couldn't believe what was happening. On Monday, the owner called me and Andy into his office, as Andy had talked to him over the weekend about what was going on. Tom didn't come into work, and basically after seeing the texts and hearing about what Tom was doing and how he was always creeping around me, he was fired. Last I heard, his wife had left him, and this was not his first foray into harassing young guys. He had been caught in a local park with another guy forcibly trying to have sex with him, and why he wasn't in jail for that, I don't know. But it turns out his wife knew he had sexual leanings towards men, but he had a good job, and she didn't want to work. As crazy as this was, the thing that still freaks me out is the zip ties and knife. What would have happened to me if he had gotten into my apartment? What if I had let him in innocently? What if Daryl wasn't there? Like I said, I'm no longer at that job, but I'm still friends with all those people. But I never want to meet Tom again. The Maniac in the Mangroves. Submitted by Aussie Jim 45. For this story, I'll call myself Jim, although that's not my real name. This happened when I was about 15, and my two friends, Greg and Tiny, were going out to the mangroves to look for mud crabs and just fuck off for a bit. We called Tiny that because even though he was 15, he was about 6'2" and could already grow a beard. So we get our stuff together and head out on our dirt bikes looking for adventure. If you're not familiar with how all of this works, there's lots of videos on YouTube you can watch, and a lot of people go out crabbing all the time. When the tide is high, it floods the mangroves, and the crabs come out, and you can hunt them. They can be really big, and their claws can slice you up pretty good if they snap at you. We were waiting around, not having much luck, and we stopped for a smoke, and we were just laughing and talking about girls and the shit teenage boys talk about. Greg and Tiny got into an argument about football teams, and I'm laughing as they're really going at it. Then I noticed something white flash a little ways away from us, through the mangroves. It looked like a man in a white shirt, but these things can be thick, and it was sunny out too. I didn't say anything and let those two fight it out, and I went looking for crabs. I saw one and called for the guys, and they came splashing over, and the hunt was on. You really have to get behind the crabs, and they can move pretty good, and they usually stick their claws up in defense, and if you're not paying attention, your hand's going to be bleeding right quick. Tiny has a stick and he's trying to get the crab to grab it, and it finally does, and I scoop it up from behind and check it, and it's legal, so I tossed him into a bucket Greg was holding. Now we were getting somewhere. Suddenly, the white movement catches my eye again, and I see it is a man with a camera, and he's coming towards us. He splashes up and demands to see our crab. He must have been spying on us. I shrugged and showed it to him, and at first he said it was a female. You can't keep females. I told him I wasn't a bloody clot and that I knew the difference between males and females. So then he says it's not legal. Greg shows him that it's way legal, and he just stands there a minute before wandering off. We all look at one another, and Tiny says, "Fucking loon." We get back after it, and after about 20 minutes, we find two at the same time. One was a male and one was a female. Tiny has one in his hands, and Greg has the other, and, oh boy, here comes this nut again. Before he can say anything, I jab my stick at Tiny's crab and say, "That's a male," and then point to Greg. "That's a female." The guy just looks at me and says, "I suppose you think you're funny, you little prick." Greg asks him what he wants, and just to fuck off and leave us alone. He stares at us and then whips his camera up and takes our picture. "I'm taking these to the authorities and tell them that you're keeping females." He then turns and splashes away. We all shake our heads, and Tiny flips his crab into our bucket, and Greg lets the other one go. It's getting on, and I say let's find one more and then get out of here. So we head back to where our dirt bikes were, and we hit pay dirt 3 more times, all males and all legal. That's when we hear shouting and splashing. Here comes Nutball again, and he's really pissed. "You little pricks just ruined my shot on purpose." We have no idea what he's talking about, and just start walking away to get to our bikes. He's actually almost running at us now and getting closer, so we pick up the pace too and get back onto dry land and near our bikes. Tiny hooks the bucket over his handlebars and starts to pedal, as so do Greg and I. But the guy is right beside us, and he throws a stick into the spokes of Greg's back wheel, and Greg crashes. The guy jumps on him and is yelling that he's taking him to the authorities. I've skidded to a stop and yell for him to leave Greg alone, but Tiny has picked up a really thick log and runs at the guy, smashing him in the side with it. The Maniac lets go of Greg with an oof, and Tony winds up for another shot, and the guy puts his hands up. I don't know why I did this, but I grabbed the guy's camera that had come off his strap and ran away with it. I took the memory card out of it, and he was screaming to give it back. I walked over, threw the camera at him, and Tiny held him at bay, telling me to get the crabs onto my bike and get going. Greg's bike wasn't ruined, but the rim was a little bent, and we could still ride it, so we took off with Tiny not too far behind us. We got home and collapsed, out of breath. And then I remembered the memory card and got my laptop and put the card in. There were dozens of pictures of us out in the mangroves, and I showed my dad, who called the police. They came out and we told them our story, and they took the card, but there wasn't much they could do except to tell us to be on the lookout, and they would also be looking for the man. One cop was really cool and wanted to see our crabs, and told us he was happy we had used our heads out there, and we got out of there the way we did. He also said we were pretty talented to have that many crabs on one hunting trip. So, to that maniac out there creeping on kids, fuck off, you cunt. The Mail by Brew. I was going back to my house from the store, and I live in a building that has another building where a couple of 100 mailboxes are. I left my dog and groceries in my truck and walked about a block to check on my mail. As I was hurrying up, I saw a lady who looked homeless or something, checking mail on the other side of my box. The mailboxes were back to back. I put the key in and opened my door and took out my mail. And then I froze. I could smell the stink of death. And then I could hear this woman putting in her key, opening her door, closing it, taking out the key, and doing that over and over. 3 times alone while I was opening mine, but whoever this was just kept doing it. I stealthily moved into a position where I could see what was going on, and watched as the figure did it twice more. And then I saw the hand holding the key, and it was, I don't know how to describe it, like brown white skin, and it looked like dead. I never saw this thing's face close up. And that's when flight kicked in, and I was gone from there and halfway to my truck, and I turned around to be sure it wasn't stalking after me. And oh shit. Here comes a lady walking 2 dogs right up to it. I say, "Hey!" and wave my arms to go back, but the lady doesn't understand, and then is right in front of this thing. I'm about 15 yards away, and I clearly heard it growl that it was waiting for her. She screamed and her 2 dogs go crazy, and they're trying to put up a defense, and I call and wave her over. They close the distance in about 5 seconds, and we all hide around the corner of the building. I lean out and peek around the corner, and the thing is in the middle of the sidewalk looking at us, and then it went back into the mail building. Her dogs are scared and shaking, and we were hiding in a flower bed behind some bushes and looking around the corner to see if anything was coming. It was 9:30 on a Friday night, and everyone is gone from the mail building. I say we need to run for my truck so we can get away, and that's exactly what we do. Now I have my dog, my groceries, this strange woman I've never met, and her 2 dogs all crammed into the cab of my truck. And we have to drive right back in front of that place to get away. She asked me what it was, and I said I didn't know, but everything I can think of is really bad. I heard it say it was waiting for you. So we drove by the building, and it was standing right in the doorway and watched us go by. She lives about 8 blocks away by the Copperline Ridge, So I parked and she got out and asked if she should call the police when she got inside. I said, hell no. If that thing's gone when they show up and you tell them that story, they're going to lock you in the nut house and throw away the key. She gave me a wan smile and then ran for her door and went inside. Well, now I have to drive by that thing one more time to get home. Sure enough, it was back inside the mailbox building, unlocking and opening the door an inch, slamming it and then locking it. It never took any mail out of the box. Just locked and unlocked, locked and unlocked. I parked, grabbed my dog under one arm and the bags of groceries and bolted straight into our place. Now, you need to understand, I had just finished work, took a shower and went shopping, and visited a friend for about 20 minutes, and came home to that, all wide awake and stone cold sober. And as a matter of fact, I had just had a cup of coffee with my friend. This all took place about 200 yards from my front door. This thing wasn't a ghost or some kind of apparition. It was solid and real and had form. It was clearly doing things, and I clearly heard it growl that it was waiting for that woman. Never have I seen anything like that in my entire life again, and I never want to. Not ever. A Creepy Campground by Bowie Hi-Hat. Last summer we were trying to find small campsites tucked into the woods in rural Vermont. We ended up finding this place, and I forget the name. It might have started with the word maple or something, but anyway, we called ahead to make reservations and everything seemed fine. So we showed up after a while of driving trying to find this place, and like I said, it was tucked back way into the woods on narrow dirt roads. We finally got there, and all that is around is the small farmhouse, and across the street is a dirt road with little outcroppings for campsites. We went up to the house, and on the porch was a sign-up sheet that we filled out and left our money in a little tin can that was on the table. We pulled out and went across the street to find our campsite. Aside from one thing that looked like a trailer and a tent, there was nobody else there. We didn't see any of people at either of the campsites that looked inhabited. One was just a tent with nothing else. No cars, no food, no nothing. The other campsite had the trailer and a picnic table with what looked like some food and silverware. There was also clothes hanging on a clothesline. We didn't think that much about it and set up our tent for the night. We walked around during sunset and checked out the really pretty scenery. There were nice views of mountain peaks and whatnot. We had planned on building a fire, but it started to rain pretty hard. And we hadn't seen any people whatsoever, and we were feeling pretty low, just sitting in a tent in the pouring rain. It got really creepy when we started hearing what sounded like someone chopping wood not too far from our tent. And I shit you not, it was terrifying. There was nobody around, but then we started hearing that out of the blue in the pouring rain? Something wasn't right. And keep in mind, it was also pitch fucking black at this time. We ended up getting back into the car and feeling pretty creeped out, and we ended up leaving and going back to my girlfriend's house. And she lived about 40 minutes away from where we were. So we went back in the morning to get our tent and stuff, and after a night of pouring rain, we see that nothing is different from the day before. All of the stuff on the picnic table was in the same place it was, and the clothes were still on the fucking line just like they were the day before. We packed up our tent real fast and got the hell out of there. I do want to go back sometime to see if everything is still in the same place as it was when we were there. Man, I know this doesn't sound that scary, but I couldn't describe to you how terrifying it would be if everything was still in place. Ed by Coelacanth. My father was a civil engineer, and my mother was a spoiled, rotten trophy wife. While I was still in the womb, they went and bought one of the largest houses in Plainsfield, Wisconsin, where something was terribly amiss. My father traveled a lot, and the house needed work. My mother had never so much as washed dishes in her whole life, and she was pregnant with me, so my parents needed a little help. My father hired this odd little man named Ed to look after the house and yard, and he spent most of his time hanging out at this mom-and-pop grocery store. According to my mother's cousins, my mom used to work Ed almost to death, and then shortchange him on his wages. One day, when my father was in town, it was snowing heavily, so he decided to drive to the farmhouse where Ed lived to pick him up. My father couldn't drive up all the way to the farmhouse because the road wasn't plowed, but he drove up as far as he could and then started honking his horn. While my father was honking, he noticed what he thought was a haunch of deer hanging in the open door of Ed's barn. When Ed finally came out and got into the car, my father told him that hunting deer was cruel. Ed just looked at my father and said that he never hunted deer. A couple of weeks later, my father was away working in Texas when he got a phone call from my mother. She was in a panic, and she told my father that somebody was murdering women in Plainsfield, and that she was all alone, and she wanted my father to come home right now, right away, that very instant. Obviously, my father couldn't do that. This was in the 50s. It would have taken days at least. So he called up one of the neighbors instead, and asked that the neighbor go over to Ed's farmhouse and pick up Ed. Ed wasn't very much, my father explained, but at least he was something. Well, the neighbor did drive over to Ed's farmhouse, and he was rather surprised to see very nearly every cop in Wisconsin there. I was born a full month later. My mother had carried me for 10 months, and I guess I didn't want to come out until it was safe, but soon afterwards, my family moved to California just to be sure. Ed's last name was Gein. He later became Robert Bloch's real-life inspiration for his character Norman Bates for his novel Psycho, and for the movies The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Buffalo Bill character in The Silence of the Lambs. That was the story I have been telling over these years because that was how it was told to me. But the truth is that Ed Gein was arrested almost a week after I was born. My mom still had carried me for 10 months, though. At the time of his arrest, they did find the body of one of Ed's victims dressed out like a deer and hanging in a shed. My parents had arrived in Plainfield in 1955. They had run afoul of the KKK in Louisiana and had moved as far away as they could without leaving the country. While they were in Wisconsin, they gave the KKK a final middle finger salute by helping the first black man get elected sheriff there. In 1956, my father had started employing Ed Gein as a handyman, and it was that November when my father tried to drive up to Ed's farmhouse to pick up Ed. In the summer of 1957, the citizens of Plainfield began noticing that something was very, very wrong in the community. They were acting like baby chicks in a barnyard being buzzed by a chicken hawk. Thankfully, the horror ended and the people of Plainfield celebrated a true Thanksgiving the following month. Decades ago at a book fair here in Las Vegas, I finally managed to talk to Robert Bloch about himself and my family's involvement with Ed Gein. He told me that while he was in Plainfield doing research for his book, he had indeed met and talked to my mother before my family had moved out of Wisconsin. "Oh, God, I remember that woman," Mr. Bloch said. "She thought my book was going to be about her." And although he had never heard this particular take on the haunch of venison story before, he did tell me that as far as he knew, Ed had never shot a deer in his life. Mr. Bloch then said that doing research in Plainfield was a little bit like investigating the Jack the Ripper murders. There was an official count of victims, and then there was the unofficial count of victims. Many of Plainfield's residents felt they had never caught the real murderer, and that people had kept on going missing, and that graves continued to be disturbed in the outlying cemeteries. Some of the townies went as far as to tell Mr. Bloch that Ed Gein was only somebody's or something's Renfield. But whatever the case was, it's been almost 6 decades since Ed Gein was caught and sent to a mental asylum where he spent the rest of his life. And I imagine the good people of Plainsfield still haven't stopped locking their doors and windows before going to bed. Something Strange in New Jersey by Baron Bloodbath. So I live in New Jersey. I'm a no-nonsense military veteran who my friends know as a straight shooter. I never put much stock in the supernatural until last year. I bought a new telescope so I could do stargazing out at Cherry Springs State Park in Pennsylvania. It's a dark sky park. You can see planets, galaxies, you name it. I live close to Philly, so if you've ever seen the Philly skies, you know there's a ridiculous amount of light pollution. So, I decided to head out to the Pine Barrens and try out my new scope. Calibrate it, if you will. As I was setting it up in a good spot, a cop comes by. Well, more like a ranger. He tells me I can't set up my scope anywhere near the road. He then directs me to a wooded area about a mile away. He says it's dark over there, and flat, too. Yeah, that's good enough for stargazing. I grumble a bit and pack up my rig, and just as the ranger said, there's a nice dark spot near a ranger's forest station. Nobody's around. It's the night of the new moon, so there's no moonlight, even if I wanted to see. I've got my car headlights and a powerful flashlight that doubles as the power source for my telescope. I set things up, level my scope, get it calibrated, and use a 2-star alignment. Before long, I'm getting good images of Saturn zoomed in on the rings. Really captivating stuff. Then I hear a loud crack. I look around, expected to see a spooked deer or some other nocturnal creature hanging out. And then there was a sound of some kind of heavy breathing, like exhaling. After thinking about it later, it sounded more like heavy wings flapping. You know that primal feeling at the back of your head, that reptilian instincts that force flight, fight, or freeze? Mine was going off like crazy, telling me I needed to stop what I was doing. Leave now, haul ass, just leave. I don't know why I ignored that feeling. Curiosity, bravado, stupidity, I don't know. At the expense of losing my already attuned night vision for 20 minutes, I turned down my car and aimed the headlights in the direction of the noise. And that's when I saw it. A flash of green, then red. 2 orbs of red, rocking back and forth slowly, like eye shine. It was standing there watching me. Holy shit, I thought. And then I tried to figure out how big it was, how tall it was. Another loud crack. And it moved. A tree limb cracked. I threw my car in gear and fled. I haven't gone back during a new moon. I'm not that foolish or brave. I did go back later during the afternoon to get an idea of where this thing was. And the oddest thing was the trees. Green trees don't break. They kind of just bend and cave. Everybody knows that. Well, there were branches as big around as my arm just snapped off with strange claw marks on them. I can't say what it was, and maybe it was a bear, but I can say I've never been more afraid in my life. Was it a Jersey Devil? Who knows, but I'm a believer now. Heaven's Gate by Official Hobain. So, I'm from a city in Australia called Adelaide. It's a pretty smallish population of about 1 million compared to the rest of the country. My friends and I for the past year have been pretty heavily involved in draining and urban exploring, water drains, abandoned buildings, etc. But due to our city's small population, there are a pretty limited number of locations to be found. So my friends and I were pretty ecstatic to find a new location being passed around by the urbexing community, known simply as Heaven's Gate. It was an abandoned retirement and brain injury ward that was scheduled to be demolished, but had been down for a good 5 years. Now, usually when a building is abandoned here, it gets pretty tightly locked up, boarded windows, padlocks, etc. But whenever an abandoned building gets scheduled to be demolished, they unlock everything, for workers and construction site managers, I presume. Anyway, my friends and I traveled to the location, which is pretty well hidden behind a lot of vegetation and a large iron fence, but still located next to a main road, with houses adjacent to the complex. We jump the fence and go out exploring, taking pictures and just messing around like teenagers do. The majority of the building has been trashed, and we found a few sleeping bags and hundreds of empty spray cans. I'm guessing the majority of the residents were Italian and Greek, as there were a lot of Greek and Italian books, posters, and VHS tapes littering the private rooms. My friends and I explored the complex without any problem, and leave within an hour of being there. The problem is, my friends moved too fucking fast through places, so a lot of my photos I took on my Nikon were either blurry or too dark, and I really wanted to get a few good shots in before the place got demolished. So the same night, I went back around 9 or 9:30. Taking photos throughout the building, I followed the main hallway as if you go through the back or the side of the building intended for nurses, you can get lost easily. So the building is pitch black, but I brought a pretty powerful hand torch, and my Nikon has a flash, so you can see pretty well. I make my way through the hallway and pass through a set of hospital-like doors. And the doors were being held open by a chair that you just climbed over. This section of the ward was the brain injury or mental ward for patients with disabilities. The doors were electronic, but since the power was off, I believe someone managed to open them with a crowbar or something like that. As I made my approach through the mental ward and taking photos, I suddenly heard a loud bang, almost like shelves or a book slamming, making me almost shit my pants. I stick my head out of the room I was currently in. I think it was like a TV area. And I look down the hall to see that the chair has been pushed out of the way, and the doors are closed. To this day, I have no clue how or what would have moved that chair, as it was filled with sand to prevent patients from throwing them or using them as weapons. It usually took at least 2 or 3 people to lift them. Anyway, the doors are now shut, and I run over to see if I can open them. I try and push, and nothing works. So I start spamming the button like crazy, but obviously power is off, so it doesn't work either. I'm not sure how the door actually works, but it had a massive black bar across the top, which I assumed was like a powerful magnet or something that can be turned on and off, and the default is just on. Anyway, I can't get the door open, and I try and press forward to see if I can find another exit. I finally find the second exit, but the double doors are closed as well, with the same system. I'm kind of freaking out because I'm not only trapped, my phone was flat, and I swore those doors were open as well from the visit with my friends. The time was about 10:30, and my parents go to sleep pretty early because they both have work, and I'm also usually out with friends until late, so missing me wouldn't be out of the ordinary. I'm kind of shitting myself at this point because no one knows I'm there, and I can't get out. I tried walking along the walls to see if I could find a window I could smash through. Nothing. I really started to get frustrated, so I started throwing these pieces of tiles on the floor, and then at the door harder and harder, not really trying to open it, just a way to deal with the stress, I suppose. Then I hear a noise of crunching tiles. I fucking freeze, hold my breath, and just listen. It was definitely footsteps. I convinced myself to call out, "Yo, help, I'm trapped." As soon as I do, the footsteps stop, and I hear a laughter of like an old woman or a heavy smoker from the other side of the doors. The laughter turned into a running away sound, and the crunching of the tiles disappeared as it became more distant. This at first made me think it was a tagger or kids, but the laugh of the old woman didn't make any sense. No one sounding that old can run that fast. Eventually my torch went out, and I was in absolute pitch black. Out of memory from earlier in the day, I managed to find a bathroom with a door which I just closed and locked. I laid in the bathtub and prayed someone would come, which, spoiler time, no one did come. I don't know if you get this, but if you're staring into the dark too long, you start to see shapes and even figures. Now imagine being alone in an abandoned mental ward and trapped and without light. You can kind of see how this would freak anyone out. Anyway, I ended up staying the night until sunrise, which is around 6 a.m. Obviously, I didn't sleep, but I walked out into the hallway to have another crack at opening the doors. FYI, I didn't know it was sunrise at the time, as everything was flat. I walked around, and to my luck found a window that I had missed before. It had been spray-painted black, and only small dots of light shined through. So I picked an object up and threw it through the window, and got out of there as fast as possible. I've been back there a few times, but I never told my friends about me going alone, as I feel that they would have gotten pissed that I went back without them. And also, they would laugh that I got stuck. So, if any of you guys are hearing this, hi! So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the story. I still don't know about the laughing or how the 2 sets of doors closed, but I'll leave that to the people's imagination, or if someone has any scientific guess about how the doors closed, feel free to comment. The White Van in the Woods by the Gas Daddy. So I thought I'd go ahead and share an encounter with a situation that seriously put me on edge and made me question everything that happened that night. I was in sophomore year of high school. At the time, a family friend who shall be called Alan was living with us. He was down on his luck and needed a place to crash for a month until he shipped off for the Army. He was around 21 and I was around 15. My buddy Jake decided to come spend the weekend with us one time in the summer. Since he and Alan got along great, I actually wanted to be part of a group for once. So I invited him over to chill. He was a freshman at the time. We were at my house in rural Florida and got the idea to sneak out that Friday night and head up to a forest not too far up the road. There was a library, and behind that library was a good 100 acres of preserved woodlands that had pathways carved through it, meant to be somewhat of an educational attraction for the guests of the library. We saw it as a place to make a bomb-ass fort in the woods. We decided to bring some tools, hammers, saws, nails, even a pair of bolt cutters to cut a section of chain fence and use that as a roof for the fort. We loaded everything up and headed out. The best way to get to the forest from my house was to walk down this little section of road and climb up a small sand dune that the road carved through. At the top of the nearly 50-degree incline, a good 2 stories up, there was a fence. We cut the fence with the bolt cutters and let ourselves in and found a good place to set up camp. We were there for a good 30 minutes, dragging around loose branches and making a ruckus when Alan decided to start on the roof. Jake decided to stay back at the fort while me and Alan went to get a section of fence. We got back to the part we cut open to get in, and as we were cutting the rest of it out, we both looked over the fence line, down the sand dune to see an old white van parked off the road, facing us, with its lights on. 2 hooded figures and a dog were standing next to it. Alan and I dropped the cutters and ran as fast as we could back to the fort. Me, being an out-of-shape asthmatic kid, and him being ready for the Rangers, Alan quickly left me in the dust. I was running for what seemed like an eternity before a hand reached out from the sticks and pulled me in. It was Alan. He threw me down to the ground next to Jake, and all of us laid prone in the sand, not making a sound. We heard the sound of footsteps shuffling through the sandy path by our fort, and as it got closer we all heard a low, raspy breathing. Whoever was running was either old or a smoker, out of shape, or any combination of the 3. I started wheezing right as the figure walked past us. Alan motioned for me to use my inhaler in my pocket. I did, and as the device puffed, the footsteps stopped. It felt like we were laying there for hours after that. But when the steps picked back up, we realized they only stopped for a second or 2. And when the footsteps left, we all whispered to each other what to do. Alan decided to be the man and give himself over to whoever these men were. His logic was, since the city courthouse was literally an 1/8 of a mile down the road, he could run there if there was trouble. Judging by the shape of the person following us, it didn't seem like he'd have any problems outrunning them, so we broke up. Alan decided to run out to the main fence and head left towards the opening in the van, while me and Jake would run a good 100 feet to the right and hop the fence into the tree line on the side of the road. We counted down, and in a flurry we all hauled ass. I've never run that fast in my life. Everything was a blur. I looked back at Alan before he crested the sand dune, our knight in camo armor, willingly confronting would-be attackers to let some 2 kids run for safety. Jake and I were running down the sandy path next to the fence when we heard the same breathing from earlier. Coming from a path that led right to the one we were on stood a very large man that let out a grunt when he saw us. We literally ran right past him on our right and kept running, faster than ever. We crested another dune and decided to jump the fence when the man couldn't possibly see us. We vaulted clean over into the bushes. We hid in the bushes and tree line next to the road as we saw a very large guy run past us on the other side of the fence on the path. He ran right past us. We were amazed our hiding spot worked, and it was as if I could hear every one of his bronchioles wheezing as he shuffled past. We held our breaths for any other sounds, and just then a voice on the other side of the roadway said, "It's okay, guys. Come on out. You're safe." We both looked in horror as a dark figure stood in the moonlight, standing on the highway, looking right at us. It took us a second, but we realized it was actually Alan. Somehow he had managed to run up the pathway a good ways, confront some crazy guy, and then casually walk down the road at least 200 feet to where we were. If that didn't make us feel out of shape, I don't know what will. We walked out and were smiling so big our cheeks hurt. We were finally out of that mess. We asked him what had happened with the guys at the van. Turns out the county sheriff uses that stretch of road to train new canine units. Hence the old van with XYZ County Sheriff lettered on the side we somehow failed to notice, and the dog we saw. We were thrilled and walked home. We felt invincible. We saw the same white van drive past us as we were walking into a gas station parking lot to grab some drinks. The officers waved at us and we waved back. We made it home safe and sound, and we all huddled in my garage, blasting music and eating all kinds of junk food. We joked about the events that had just happened when I realized something. I asked Alan how many people he saw, and when he first looked over the fence at the van, that is. He said he saw 2 men with a dog. I agreed, and then asked him how many people he saw when he walked down to greet them. He said 2 men and a dog. I asked if the van had all its seats in, and he said the sliding door was open and the interior light was on. It had only the front 2 seats, and the back had a bunch of towels and carpet for the dog or something, along with some cases of what he assumed were toys to train the dog with. I felt my stomach sink, and asked him in a broken voice, if it was only those 2 men, and neither of them walked away from the van, who the fuck chased us through the woods? All 3 of us stared at each other, not having an answer to that question. Thanks for listening, gang. If you haven't already, please subscribe and share, and if you feel so inclined, like this post and channel. You can also give me a tip over at Patreon if you want, but of course that's not necessary. Find me on social media too. All of my outlets are in the description below. Much more to come, and be sure to send your stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com, especially if you have a creepy fast food story. Have a great day, evening, night, morning, no matter where you are around the round world. And remember to be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.